Case number 1, Tiffany Moss. 10 years old, 32 pounds, a bedroom that had become a cell, and a stepmother who walked past the door every single day in shows again and again to do nothing. By the time the world learned the name Imani Moss, there was no longer a child left to save, only a story to tell in a reckoning long overdue. This is that story. Imani Gabrielle Moss was born on April 23, 2003, into circumstances that offered her very little runway. Her biological mother, entangled in addiction, eventually surrendered parental rights to all 5 of her children. Imani's father, Iman Moss, stepped in to raise her, and by most accounts the early years were manageable. He attended Freedom Christian Church in his Georgia community, and it was within those walls that he met Tiffany, quiet-mannered, patient-faced, working as a preschool teacher. They married in July of 2009 and had 2 children together. From the outside, it had the shape of a family rebuilding itself, but the outside of a thing has always been its most deceptive feature. The first crack appeared in March of 2010. 6-year-old Imani arrived at school carrying a fear no child that age should know. She told a school nurse she was terrified to go home with a poor report card. When the nurse examined her, she found bruising, welts, and scabs across Imani's arms, back, chest, and shoulders. Tiffany had beaten her with a leather belt, sometimes using the buckle end. She was arrested and charged with first-degree child cruelty, but instead of facing a full trial, she accepted a plea arrangement under Georgia's first offender program, 5 years of probation, parenting classes, and the loss of her teaching position. And when the paperwork was processed and the caseworkers moved on to the next file, Imani was returned to the same home. It would prove to be a catastrophic decision. By the late summer of 2013, the family had relocated to an apartment in Lawrenceville, Georgia. Iman was working 2 jobs, absent for most of the day and well into the night, which left Tiffany as the primary caretaker. It was during this stretch, unobserved, unaccountable, alone with the child, that Tiffany Moss made the decision to stop feeding her stepdaughter. Prosecutors would later establish that the starvation lasted several weeks. Imani was confined to her room. She had no one within reach, no adult coming for her, no voice that carried beyond those 4 walls. At some point during this period, neighbors and other children in the complex noticed Imani slipping outside at night to rummage through trash cans for food. A 10-year-old child, hiding in the dark, scavenging, because going back inside was worse. Ask yourself what a home has to feel like for a child to choose that. Imani Moss took her last breath on October 28, 2013. She was 10 years old. She weighed 32 pounds, roughly the weight of an average 3-year-old. What came next was an attempt to make her disappear entirely. Iman Moss would later testify that he came home and found Imani unresponsive. Rather than call for emergency services, the 2 of them drove to a Home Depot, purchased charcoal, lighter fluid, and a galvanized steel trash can, and attempted to incinerate her remains. Police discovered Imani's body on November 2, 2013, at the Coventry Point Apartments. District Attorney Danny Porter, a man who had prosecuted serious offenses for decades, called it the worst case he had ever encountered. Iman Moss accepted a plea agreement in August of 2015. He pleaded guilty, received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, and agreed to testify against his wife. When Tiffany Moss's trial finally arrived in April of 2019, nearly 6 years after Imani's death, what unfolded in that Gwinnett County courtroom was almost as chilling as the crime itself. Tiffany Moss chose to represent herself, and having made that choice, she did absolutely nothing. She asked no questions of the 18 witnesses who testified against her. She gave no opening statement. She made no closing argument. She called no witnesses. She simply sat, alone at the defense table, still, expressionless, while the full weight of what she had done to Imani was assembled, piece by piece, in front of a jury. It was a performance of contempt so complete that it bordered on the theatrical. Chief Assistant District Attorney Lisa Jones told the jury in her closing, Imani would go outside and sleep in the bushes rather than be inside that apartment. A child chose the cold ground and the open night over her own home, over her stepmother. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts: murder, cruelty to children, and concealing a death. The following day, May 1st, 2019, they returned to sentence Tiffany Moss to death by lethal injection. She showed no reaction. When Judge George Hutchinson asked if she had anything to say before the sentence was handed down, her answer was 3 words: "No, sir." Tiffany Moss is presently the only woman on death row in the state of Georgia, held at Arendelle State Prison. Her case triggered meaningful reforms in how Georgia's Child Services Division handles complaints involving children already flagged in the system. Imani's surviving siblings were adopted together by their foster family and remain out of public life. What lingers about the Tiffany Moss case is not one single act of violence. It is the accumulation, weeks of deliberate neglect, a decade of abuse, a system that returned a child to danger 5 separate times, and a woman who sat through an entire murder trial and found nothing worth saying. Imani Moss had people around her entire short life. Not one of them saved her. And the one who should have loved her most made absolutely certain they would not get the chance. Case number 2, Jessica Bundren. 6-year-old children do not possess sophisticated vocabularies for suffering. They cannot articulate compound fractures or deep tissue trauma. They speak in simpler terms. "It hurts. I'm scared. Please stop." When Ariana Rose Battelle whispered those words during the final weeks of her life in Bryan, Texas, nobody outside the walls of her Garden Acres home heard them. And on October 27, 2020, when emergency responders arrived to find her small body draped beneath a sheet, those words had already been silenced forever. How does a wooden paddle become an instrument of death? Someone carves it, sands it, shapes the wood until the grain runs smooth beneath their fingers. Jessica Bundren, a 40-year-old woman living with her boyfriend Justin Hopper and his twin daughters, had such a paddle in her possession. She also had a belt, and she had a set of beliefs about correction and consequences that would prove incompatible with a child's survival. What happens in the space between discipline and destruction? Where exactly does the line blur? For the twins living in that home, the answer came in increments. A slap here, a strike there, pain accumulating like compound interest on a debt they didn't understand they owed. The call came in just after 9 in the evening. A child had stopped breathing. When first responders entered the residence on Garden Acres, Bundren offered the explanation that flows most naturally from a guilty mind. Ariana had fallen down the stairs earlier in the day. She'd put the girl to bed. When she checked on her later, the child wasn't breathing. Stairs. Always the stairs. Why do abusers default to staircase accidents with such predictable frequency? Perhaps because falls downstairs provide plausible deniability. Bruises can be explained, marks rationalized. Except the injuries documented by responding officers that night told a story that had nothing to do with gravity and everything to do with sustained violence. Belt marks, extensive bruising across the child's body. When questioned, Bundren's narrative shifted like sand beneath incoming tide. She admitted striking Ariana 6 times with a belt as retribution for bedwetting. 6 strikes for a 6-year-old. The mathematical precision of it cuts deeper than random cruelty. This was calculated, measured. Ariana's twin sister, discovered with a black eye, a scab on her neck, 2 broken fingers, and moving with visible difficulty, provided investigators with details about how punishment functioned in that household. Eat your lunch too slowly? Belt or paddle. Wet the bed? Belt or paddle. Fail to complete homework quickly enough? Belt or paddle. The twins lived inside a narrow corridor of acceptable behavior, and the margins for error had been whittled down to nothing. Justin Hopper, the girl's biological father, initially claimed ignorance about the violence. He knew nothing, he told police, but his cell phone betrayed him. Investigators discovered photographs and text messages exchanged between them in a digital catalog of injury and acknowledgement. The images showed the accumulating damage to his daughter's bodies, sent to him primarily when he was away from home. The captions indicated the girls were being uncooperative during meals, during homework, during the ordinary friction of daily life that occurs in every household with children. What separates a typical family's frustrations from the Bundren-Hopper household? Other parents feel irritation when a child dawdles over dinner. They do not document the resulting injuries with a smartphone camera. Other parents lose patience when homework takes longer than expected. They do not send photographic updates of bruises to their partner as though filing a report.
The case emerged during the autumn of 2020, a period when much of the world had retreated indoors to escape a pandemic. Schools had shifted to virtual platforms, extended family maintained distance. The social infrastructure that typically catches signs of child abuse, teachers who notice a flinch, school nurses who document unexplained marks, coaches who observe behavioral changes, had collapsed. Child Protective Services across the nation reported a 33% drop in abuse reports during this period, not because abuse declined, but because the watchers had been removed from their posts. Children suffering behind closed doors remained invisible. Ariana and her twin fell through a gap that widened precisely when vulnerable children needed protection most. When Bundren's trial commenced in November of 2023, medical testimony painted a portrait of prolonged agony. A forensic expert stated plainly that Ariana had been beaten to death and subjected to extended torment. The expert noted that the child's death unfolded slowly and painfully. During sentencing hearings, a forensic nurse who had examined the surviving twin told the jury about her career, treating approximately 400 abuse victims. This case, she said, ranked as the worst she had encountered. The volume of bruising exceeded anything in her professional experience. The child struggled to move, her body broadcasting pain that she had learned not to verbally acknowledge anymore. What does it tell us when a 6-year-old has been conditioned to disconnect from her own physical distress? When suffering becomes so routine that the mind develops mechanisms to float somewhere else? The surviving twins' counselor testified that 3 years after her sister's death, the girl continues to dissociate whenever Ariana's name enters conversation. The brain protects itself through whatever means available. When memory becomes unbearable, consciousness simply departs. The child submitted a letter to the court during sentencing with 2 distinct sections, one addressed to the judge, another to Bundren. In that letter, she articulated both her hatred for the woman who had tortured her and her profound heartbreak over losing her sister. Imagine being 9 years old and having to locate language for that depth of loss. The vocabulary barely exists at that age for regular grief, let alone for grief compounded by betrayal and trauma. Defense attorneys attempted to redirect blame onto Hopper, arguing that Bundren's intent was never to cause severe harm. The presence of male DNA on Ariana's body introduced additional complexity into determining which adult inflicted which specific injuries. Medical examiners testified that from a forensic pathology perspective, the exact attribution of individual wounds was less relevant than the overall pattern: prolonged torture administered by the adults responsible for her care. Whether a particular strike came from Bundren or Hopper mattered less than the reality that both participated in a system that transformed daily life into a minefield of potential punishment for offenses as minor as eating paste or involuntary bedwetting. The Brazos County jury required less than 1 hour to reach their verdict: guilty of injury to a child with intent to cause serious harm. During sentencing deliberations, they assigned the maximum penalty available: life imprisonment with a $10,000 fine. Courtney Onstadt, Ariana's aunt, expressed relief that Bundren received exactly what her actions warranted. The surviving twin, Onstadt noted, could now live without fearing her abuser might someday walk freely through the world.
Hopper faced his own trial in June of 2024. Friends and his father testified that before his involvement with Bundren, Hopper had been a loving father. The jury apparently found that transformation insufficient to excuse his complicity. They convicted him and assigned a life sentence with possibility of parole. Kimberly Elias, Hopper's stepmother and the twins' grandmother, told reporters that while grateful for the verdict, no punishment could restore what had been stolen. The family had endured testimony and viewed photographs during trial that would remain permanently etched in their minds. Images of beaten, bruised bodies belonging to children who should have been playing, learning, growing. Bundren's own father had bonded her out of jail following her initial arrest. He wanted to give her opportunity to reintegrate into society and find employment. She spent 1 year free before trial. What does a person think about during that year? Does the mind replay the events, searching for the moment when correction transformed into catastrophe? Or has rationalization already constructed such elaborate scaffolding that genuine reflection becomes impossible? The human capacity for self-justification runs extraordinarily deep. We can convince ourselves of almost anything given sufficient motivation. Jessica Bundren now serves her life sentence in a Texas state facility. Ariana Rose Battelle remains permanently 6 years old, her existence reduced to court transcripts, news articles, and the memories carried by those who loved her. Her twin moves forward bearing scars, visible and invisible, learning to navigate existence in a world where the people meant to protect her became the architects of her harm. She will grow up. She will have birthdays. She will experience milestones her sister never reached. And perhaps, in some distant future, she will find peace. But that future seems impossibly far when you're 9 years old and still dissociating at the mention of your twin's name. The case forces uncomfortable questions about family structure, about warning signs missed, about systems that failed. It happened during a pandemic when isolation provided cover for cruelty. It involved a stepmother and a biological father working in tandem. It unfolded over months while the wider world focused on vaccines and case counts and lockdown protocols. And it ended with a child dead and another child learning to survive in the aftermath of the unthinkable, carrying forward into adolescence and eventually adulthood the knowledge that the people who should have loved her most became the source of her deepest wounds. Case number 3, Diana Medina Flores. A circus was coming to Bloomington, Indiana. Bright posters, open skies, the promise of wonder for families who would pack their children into cars and drive out for a night of spectacle. And somewhere in that same town, tucked inside a budget motel room, a 12-year-old boy named Eduardo Pozo was chained to a bathtub, silent, unseen, disappearing. The people handing out flyers for that circus were his own father and stepmother. One of them was Diana Medina Flores. This is her story. Eduardo Pozo was born in Florida into a family that, at least on the surface, functioned like many others in their modest rural community in Mayaca City in Manatee County. He attended local public schools alongside his siblings, and by all accounts from teachers and neighbors who knew him, he was a warm, spirited child, skilled at juggling, quick to smile, someone people genuinely liked being around. His biological mother, Aria Esmeralda Garcia, lost custody and last saw her son in 2017. The woman who stepped into the role of caretaker in her place was Diana Medina Flores, the partner of Eduardo's father, Luis Pozo Jr. What teachers and church members in Mayaca City noticed, they could not fully name at first. Eduardo always wore long sleeves. He was always hungry, not the casual hunger of a growing boy between meals, but something more urgent, something that made him scarf food the moment it was placed in front of him. His behavior was described as fearful in ways that did not quite fit any ordinary explanation. Between March 2017 and November 2018, at least 5 separate complaints were filed with Child Protective Services detailing bruising on his body. Each time, investigators assessed the situation and closed the case. Eduardo, coached or simply too afraid, denied the abuse. His caretakers offered explanations. The files were put away. In December 2018, a Child Protective Services investigator visited Eduardo for what would be the last documented welfare check. They took a photograph of him. He was smiling. That image would later become one of the most heartbreaking details in the entire case. A boy smiling for the camera just weeks before his world closed entirely around him. Days after that visit, Luis Pozo pulled Eduardo and his siblings out of school. The family left Florida and took to the road, working as promotional contractors for a traveling circus, driving from city to city distributing flyers and advertising shows. Eduardo's mother had no idea they had gone. Neither did anyone who had been watching him.
What happened to Eduardo Pozo during those months on the road can only be understood as a sustained and deliberate withdrawal of everything a child needs to survive. He was denied food. He lost weight week by week in a way that should have been visible to every adult around him. At some point, the abuse became more structured. Eduardo was restrained with wrist and ankle bindings. A dog training shock collar was placed around his neck. A camera was set up to monitor him. And when his father and stepmother left the motel room each day to hand out circus flyers and tend to their 3 other children, Eduardo was left alone in the bathroom, chained, hungry, and without a single person to call out to. His 3 siblings, a 9-year-old girl and 2 boys aged 5 and 2, showed no signs of the same treatment. Investigators would later note this with a particular kind of grim clarity. It was Eduardo specifically, Eduardo alone. And the question that hangs over the entire case, the one that keeps returning no matter how many times you read the details, is simply, why him?
What is it in the architecture of a person that allows them to look at one child and decide that child does not deserve the basic conditions of life? In late May of 2019, the family had arrived in Bloomington, Indiana, staying at the Economy Inn Motel. On the morning of May 24th, Eduardo stopped breathing inside that room. His father drove him to IU Health Bloomington Hospital. Eduardo was pronounced dead within 10 minutes of arrival. He was 12 years old. He weighed between 50 and 55 pounds. His body carried bruising across nearly every surface, and the Monroe County coroner, Joni Shields, confirmed he had 0% body fat at the time of his death. Monroe County Sheriff Brad Swain, a man with 30 years of law enforcement experience, stood before the media and said plainly that he could not think of another case like it in his entire career. Diana Medina Flores and Luis Pozo Jr. were arrested and charged within days. Both initially denied withholding food, though the physical evidence against them was beyond dispute. Investigators found the restraints, the chains, the shock collar, and photographs on their cell phones that documented what Eduardo had endured in that bathroom. When murder charges followed, the full weight of what had been done to him became a matter of legal record. Medina Flores pleaded guilty to murder. In her defense, her attorneys argued that she had herself been a victim of abuse at the hands of Luis Pozo, that her undocumented immigration status created a power imbalance that left her with little agency, and that on at least one occasion she had secretly fed Eduardo and been punished for it by Pozo. The Monroe Circuit Court considered those arguments and rejected them as sufficient grounds for leniency. Judge Christine Talley Haseman sentenced Diana Medina Flores to 65 years in prison, the maximum. When Medina Flores appealed, arguing the sentence was excessive, the Indiana Court of Appeals upheld every year of it. The appeals court noted in its decision that her complete disregard for Eduardo's life was, in their own word, astonishing. Luis Pozo Jr. was sentenced to 65 years as well. Eduardo's mother, Audia Garcia, had tried. His grandmother had tried. His teachers noticed. His pastor noticed. Neighbors flagged their concerns. Child Protective Services opened investigations 5 times and closed them 5 times. And still, Eduardo Pozo ended up chained in a motel bathroom in Indiana, invisible to the world, while a circus poster for the show his father and stepmother were promoting hung somewhere nearby, promising spectacle and joy to people who did not know that just rooms away, a child was spending the last days of his life alone. There is no neat way to close a story like this one. No sentence handed down in a courtroom fully accounts for what Eduardo never got to become. The juggler, the smiling boy in the photograph, the young man his teachers believed in. He was 12 years old. He had a heart of gold, and he deserved so much more than the life that was taken from him.
Case number 4. Natiela Barros. Breakfast should be a simple affair. Toast, perhaps some eggs, the morning sun filtering through kitchen windows while a child prepares for the day ahead. Yet, on the morning of January 30th, 2024, in a quiet home on Vine Springs Trace in Bethlehem, Georgia, breakfast became the stage for something incomprehensible.
8-year-old Saida Barros sat at the table, her fingers absently playing with her toast instead of focusing on the schoolwork spread before her. Her stepmother, 34-year-old Natiela Barros, watched this small act of childhood distraction and felt anger rising within her. What follows is a story not just of violence, but of how ordinary moments can spiral into irreversible tragedy when rage replaces reason. Every parent knows the frustration of a child who refuses to focus, the wandering attention, the fidgeting, the endless reminders to stay on task. It's part of the contract of raising young humans whose brains are still learning discipline and self-control. But somewhere in Natiela Barros's mind, this normal childhood behavior transformed into something unforgivable. She had already administered what she termed discipline earlier that morning for the same infraction, yet when she glanced over and saw Saida still not concentrating on her homework, something inside her snapped. She walked to the kitchen. Her hands found a wooden rolling pin, the kind typically used for preparing dough, for creating food, for acts of domestic care. In those moments, the object transformed from tool to weapon. What happened next would change multiple lives forever and expose a household where correction had long ago crossed into cruelty. Natiela struck Saida between 10 and 20 times, focusing particular attention on the back of the child's neck. The blows rained down while an 8-year-old girl tried to comprehend why playing with toast warranted this response. What thoughts passed through Saida's mind as the strikes continued? Did she understand what was happening? Did she call out for her father? When the violence finally ceased, Saida lay unconscious. Her small body had endured trauma no child should face. And here, the story takes another turn that defies logic and compassion. Natiela did not immediately call for emergency services. She did not rush her stepdaughter to a hospital. Instead, she reached for her phone and called Cledir Barros, Saida's father, who was away from home working his truck driving route. The conversation that followed would later become central to the criminal case against both adults. Cledir told his wife to pray. He instructed her to seek spiritual intervention rather than medical attention for a child whose life was slipping away. Natiela then made additional calls, reaching out to 2 Nigerian priests. When Cledir finally arrived home, he found his daughter unconscious on the floor. Rather than immediately dialing 911, he knelt beside Saida and prayed. For 10 to 20 minutes, while an 8-year-old girl's brain suffered oxygen deprivation, her father asked God for intervention instead of calling the people trained to provide it. What kind of faith demands prayer before action when a child lies dying? What belief system prioritizes spiritual ritual over immediate medical care? Only after those prayer sessions concluded did someone finally call emergency services. Responders arrived to find Saida already gone. There would be no revival, no last-minute save. The delay had cost her the small window where intervention might have mattered. When detectives began investigating, the story Natiela and Cledir initially offered started crumbling under scrutiny. They had to explain the marks on Saida's body, the pattern of injuries consistent with repeated strikes from a hard object.
The rolling pin, investigators would learn, became Natiela's preferred instrument when anger overtook her judgment. But this wasn't an isolated incident. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of abuse within the Barros household. Cledir himself admitted to authorities that his daughter had behavioral issues. He described her as having 2 personalities and causing problems in his marriage because she had been born during a period when he and Natiela were separated. He referred to his own child as a demon. Think about that language for a moment. A father describing his 8-year-old daughter in terms typically reserved for spiritual evil. He acknowledged that Natiela would lose her temper and discipline Saida inappropriately, causing visible bruising. He knew this was happening, and he did nothing to stop it. Records from the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services revealed even more troubling details. All the children in the household received regular physical punishment, but Saida bore the brunt of the violence. She had been pulled from regular school due to alleged behavioral problems and was being homeschooled, which meant fewer eyes on her welfare. No teachers to notice new bruises, no counselors to ask gentle questions about what was happening at home. The isolation made her more vulnerable, cutting off the safety net that sometimes catches children in danger.
Syra had been born during Claydeer and Natiella's separation, a reminder of a troubled period in their relationship. When they eventually reunited and had 2 more children together, Syra became the outsider, the child who didn't quite fit the narrative of their re-established family. She allegedly stole things, acted out, required extra attention and patience. In other words, she behaved like many children who sense they're not fully wanted, who act out because negative attention feels better than being invisible. And rather than seek help for a struggling child, her parents responded with escalating punishment. Natiella Barros now faces charges including malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, aggravated assault, and first-degree cruelty to children. During her initial court appearance, when asked about her employment status, she replied that she was a stay-at-home mom. The judge denied bond, noting that she posed a danger. Claydeer Barros faces second-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree child cruelty charges. His arrest warrant states plainly that he was aware of ongoing abuse, continued leaving the children unsupervised with their abuser, and when informed of a medical emergency, failed to seek appropriate care. His daughter died as a result of that negligence. Claydeer has faced 3 separate trials, with the first 2 ending in hung juries, as jurors struggled to determine his level of culpability. He testified that as a truck driver, he was only home 2 days per week and claimed ignorance about the extent of abuse. Yet his own statements to investigators contradicted this defense. He admitted knowing about Natiella's anger issues and inappropriate discipline. He acknowledged previous incidents where she had gone too far. And on the day Syra died, when his wife called to say their daughter was gone, he chose prayer over emergency services. The case raises profound questions about parental responsibility and the insidious nature of child abuse within families. Syra wasn't a stranger to these people. She was Claydeer's biological daughter, a child he helped bring into the world. Yet somewhere along the way, she became inconvenient, problematic, other. The standard of care that most parents extend naturally to their children vanished, replaced by a system where minor infractions warranted violence, and where an 8-year-old playing with toast at breakfast could trigger a response that ended her life. Natiella Barros now awaits trial in Gwinnett County, her case moving through a justice system attempting to hold her accountable for actions that defy comprehension. Syra Barros remains forever 8 years old, her brief life marked by suffering at the hands of the very people tasked with protecting her. And in communities across Georgia and beyond, this story serves as a stark reminder that danger to children often comes not from strangers, but from within homes where love should dwell, but cruelty has taken root instead.
Case number 5. Judith Hawkey. Most people, when they hear the word stepmother, think of a woman who stepped into a difficult role, someone who chose, against all the easier options, to show up for children that were not hers by birth. Judith Hawkey of Oakwood, Ohio, made a very different kind of choice. She looked at a 10-year-old boy named Corey, studied the particular softness of a child who trusts the adults around him completely, and decided that what he was, impressionable, dependent, afraid of her, was something she could use. What followed is one of the most disturbing cases in the history of Ohio's criminal courts, not because of what Judith Hawkey did herself, but because of who she made do it for her. Robert Breininger was a man living an ordinary life in Defiance County, Ohio, when he married Judith Hawkey. He had a son, Corey, from a previous relationship, and by all accounts, Robert was a present and devoted father. The early years of the blended household are not heavily documented in the public record, but what emerged during the eventual trial painted a clear and deeply troubling portrait of what life looked like for Corey inside that home. According to prosecutors, Judith subjected the boy to ongoing physical and emotional mistreatment over a sustained period, the kind of calculated conditioning that strips a child of his sense of reality, of what is normal, of what he is allowed to refuse. Then came November 3, 2003. Corey Breininger was 10 years old that afternoon. At some point during that day, Robert Breininger was shot inside the family home. When emergency services arrived, they found the boy hysterical and beside himself, telling the 911 operator, as he attempted CPR on his father, that he had not known there was a bullet in the gun. The shooting was investigated. Authorities spoke to Corey, looked at the available evidence, and reached a conclusion. This was a terrible accident. A child who had not known the weapon was loaded, a father who was gone too soon. A tragedy, not a crime. The case was closed.
Judith Hockey collected on Robert's life insurance policy, and the world moved on. For 9 years, it stayed that way. Then, somewhere between May 2011 and March 2012, Corey, now a young man of 19, began to speak, first to a teacher he trusted, then to others, and what he said rewrote everything. The shooting had not been an accident. Corey had pulled the trigger, yes, but he had done so because Judith Hockey had told him to. According to his account, she had subjected him to years of abuse, established an atmosphere of complete control, and on that November day had directed him, a 10-year-old boy, to end his own father's life. He had then been coached on what to say to police, and for 9 years, terrified and conditioned, he had said it. The case was reopened. The death of Robert Breininger was reclassified as a homicide, and in March of 2013, a Defiance County grand jury indicted Judith Hockey on 1 count of aggravated murder, 4 counts of child endangering, and 1 count of insurance fraud. She pleaded not guilty to every charge. The trial that followed in 2013 drew significant attention across Ohio. The prosecution brought 25 witnesses to the stand. Corey himself testified against his stepmother, recounting in detail what she had put him through and what she had asked of him on the day his father died. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Judith Hockey to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the aggravated murder charge, with an additional 20 years for the child endangering and insurance fraud charges to run consecutively. It was, on the surface, a resolution, a long-delayed accounting for what had been done to a child and to his father. But the legal story was far from finished. In March of 2016, the 3rd District Court of Appeals overturned Hockey's conviction and ordered a new trial. The appeals court, led by Judge John Willimine, identified serious problems with how certain testimony had been admitted at trial. The court found that the statement Corey made to his teacher in 2012, nearly 9 years after the shooting, had been improperly allowed in as an excited utterance, a legal exception that requires a statement to be made under the immediate stress of a startling event. 9 years, the court pointed out, is not immediate. Additionally, expert testimony from a psychologist who testified as part of the prosecution's case in chief was found to have been admitted improperly. The court noted plainly that the evidence of guilt in the case was not overwhelming and that these errors had tainted the outcome. Judith Hockey was granted a new trial. It was a stunning turn, and it posed a difficult question for prosecutors. Could they rebuild their case from the ground up, relying on evidence that an appeals court had already described as shaky? Could Corey carry the weight of a second trial, walking once again through everything he had carried for over a decade? In the end, the case resolved without a second jury. Judith Hockey accepted a plea agreement and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Given that she had already served time following her original conviction, her projected release came in 2023. Whether she has since been released has not been confirmed in publicly available records at the time of this writing. Corey Breininger was never charged. He was 10 years old when the shooting occurred, and prosecutors consistently treated him as a victim of coercion rather than a perpetrator. In the years since the trial, Corey has spoken publicly about his experiences, started a YouTube channel, and chosen to live his life in the open rather than in the shadow of what was done to him and what he was made to do. What the Judith Hockey case forces every person watching to sit with is an almost unbearable question. What does it take to reach inside a 10-year-old child, past every instinct of love and protection he has for his own father, and turn him into a weapon? What kind of hold does a person need to have over a small boy to make him do the unthinkable, and then keep him silent for 9 years? The justice system wrestled with those questions across 2 trials, one overturned conviction, and a plea deal that many felt did not fully answer them. Robert Breininger is still gone. Corey Breininger still carries November 3, 2003 with him every day. And Judith Hockey, the woman at the center of it all, remains one of the most disturbing figures in the long and difficult history of crimes committed against the children who trusted us most.
Case number 6, Monique Osuna. When nanny cameras entered the consumer market, manufacturers marketed them as tools for peace of mind, a way for working parents to ensure their children received proper care while they were away. Nobody imagined these devices would one day capture evidence of something so disturbing that veteran detectives would struggle to watch the footage. Yet in a Meridian, Idaho apartment during the late summer months of 2020, hidden cameras recorded something that transformed surveillance into documentation of sustained torture. The person inflicting this treatment wasn't a stranger hired off the internet. She was Monique Osuna, the 27-year-old stepmother who was supposed to protect 9-year-old Emmerich Osuna. How does a home become a prison? The transformation happens gradually, doesn't it? One boundary crossed, then another, each violation building upon the last until what was once unthinkable becomes routine. For Emmerich, this descent began after he arrived in Idaho in February of 2018 to live with his father Eric and stepmother Monique. His biological mother, Cecil Lucero, had been incarcerated in California for severely harming his younger half-siblings, twins she had struck with such force that one sustained a brain bleed while the other suffered a skull fracture and broken ribs. Lucero admitted jealousy drove her violence. She resented the attention their father gave the babies. With his mother behind bars, custody shifted to Eric, and Emmerich traveled north to what should have been safety. Instead, he found something worse. The pandemic of 2020 created conditions that isolated children from the very people who might have noticed something wrong. Schools closed, remote learning replaced classrooms, Monique worked from home, and Emmerich remained there with her day after day, without teachers or counselors or anyone else to observe the deterioration of his circumstances. Prosecutor Tamara Kelly would later describe how this isolation provided Monique continuous access to the boy, unfettered by outside oversight. What began as discipline escalated into something unrecognizable as parenting. The nanny cameras captured it all, hours upon hours of footage showing a small child being compelled to perform repetitive exercises, wall sits, jumping jacks, one-legged stands, movements called inchworms, sometimes for 12 hours at a stretch, sometimes for 20. Why exercises? Perhaps because they provided the veneer of structure, of building discipline, of making a child stronger. Except the purpose wasn't strengthening, it was punishment. It was control, and it was relentless. Investigator Melanie Yamada Anderson testified that throughout the footage she reviewed, the household pets received better treatment than Emmerich. When hunger drove him to eat from the garbage or consume dog food, he was beaten for it. He slept on bare floors without pillows or blankets, or sometimes in a hallway closet where Monique would wake him in the early morning hours to inflict more punishment. One video showed her instructing him to scrub floors with a toothbrush and hot water. As she filled the pot, her voice came through clearly. Hot water to burn the skin off Emmerich. Detective Travis Stoffel described one particular morning when Emmerich exercised at 3 or 4 in the morning. Suddenly, the boy stopped, turned his face upward, and began speaking to God. He asked why this was happening to him. He cried, and in the background of the footage, Monique could be seen sneaking up behind a counter, hiding there, listening to his prayer. Stoffel said that moment affected him more than anything else in the case. What kind of person eavesdrops on a child's desperate conversation with his creator? What goes through someone's mind as they crouch behind furniture, listening to a 9-year-old boy ask God to explain his suffering?
The footage captured Monique yelling profanity as Emmerich exercised. She withheld food and water, taunting him by allowing his siblings to eat in front of him while she screamed in his face. In one video, she struck him with a frying pan. His response was crying and pleading for her to stop. Another showed her telling him, "You were on my list for the rest of your life." As the weeks progressed, Emmerich became visibly thinner on camera, his ribs and spine protruding through his skin in the grainy black and white video. Eric Osuna, Emmerich's biological father, rarely appeared in the footage. When he did, prosecutors noted he often sat on his phone or watched television while his wife berated his son. Sometimes he encouraged the punishment. Sometimes he participated. What he never did was intervene. He never called for help. He never took his son to safety. When both adults eventually realized Emmerich was severely injured, they waited hours before dialing 911. By the time first responders arrived at the apartment on September 1st, 2020, Emmerich lay unconscious and without a pulse. Paramedics rushed him to St. Luke's Children's Hospital, where he passed away the following day, September 2nd. The autopsy revealed the extent of what Emmerich had endured. Dark purple bruising covered his small body. His buttocks, genital area, thighs, and arms bore marks consistent with repeated strikes. He weighed 41 pounds at death, severely underweight for a 9-year-old boy.
The medical evidence supported what the camera footage had already shown. This child had been systematically starved, beaten, and deprived of basic human dignity for months. Monique and Eric Osuna were arrested and charged. Both initially pleaded not guilty, but as the evidence mounted, particularly the damning nanny camera footage, their legal positions shifted. Monique pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in February of 2022. As part of the plea agreement, prosecutors agreed not to seek her execution. During her allocution, she offered a statement that rang hollow against the backdrop of what she had done. "Before I knew it, I was abusing him," as though the transformation had been sudden, accidental, something that simply happened to her rather than choices she made repeatedly over months. Her sentencing hearing in June of 2022 lasted 2 days. Prosecutors presented the autopsy photographs in open court, images showing the extent of bruising and emaciation that marked Emmerich's final days. They played portions of the nanny camera footage, including the moment when the boy prayed. Monique sat in the courtroom wiping tears from her eyes, her quiet sobs audible to those in the gallery. Were those tears of genuine remorse, or tears of someone finally confronting the consequences of their actions? Ada County prosecutor John Dinger summed up the case in his closing statement. A small child was sent to Idaho to be cared for by the defendants. Instead, he was sent to a living hell. The judge sentenced Monique Osuna to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. She will spend the remainder of her days in an Idaho state facility. Eric Osuna's legal journey proved more complicated. He was initially found mentally incompetent to stand trial, though the nature of his mental health issues was never publicly disclosed. Eventually, he pleaded guilty to murder as well and received his own life sentence. His stepmother, Marie Osuna, told reporters the family was grateful for the verdict, but acknowledged no punishment could restore what had been stolen. The trial had required them to view photographs and hear testimony that would remain permanently etched in their memories. Cecil Lucero, Emmerich's biological mother, submitted a victim impact statement through prosecutors. She wrote that she would never recover from losing her son, that he had been loved by her and her family, and that the defendants had never cared about his well-being. The irony cuts deep. Lucero had lost custody for harming her other children, yet the parent granted care of Emmerich proved even more dangerous. Julia Yackel, a mitigation specialist, researched Monique Osuna's history and testified about what she found. At age 2, Monique had been removed from her California home along with her brother and placed in Orangewood, an emergency facility for harmed children. Multiple allegations of mistreatment existed regarding her childhood home. Yackel stated that placement in such a facility at such a young age would have created significant lifelong harm. Does this history explain what Monique became? Does it excuse what she did? The answer to both questions is no. Many people survive terrible childhoods without becoming torturers. Suffering doesn't grant license to inflict suffering. Emmerich's body was returned to Orange County, California, where his aunt and uncle, who had cared for him before his move to Idaho, organized his funeral. Community members in Idaho who had never met the boy held a vigil in Caldwell, gathering to honor a child whose brief life had been marked by cruelty from the adults meant to love him. Marie Osuna said through tears that if she could get a message to Emmerich, she would tell him he was loved. "I'm sorry. We're sorry that he had to go through that pain and that we love him." Emmerich Osuna remains forever 9 years old, his existence reduced to court transcripts, news coverage, and horrifying video footage that captured his final weeks. His case stands as another reminder that the greatest danger to children often comes not from strangers, but from within homes where love should dwell, but cruelty has taken root instead. Case number 7. Amanda Carmack. 6 siblings, 1 missing child, and a stepmother who knew exactly where she was. On August 31, 2019, in the small town of Gas City, Indiana, 10-year-old Skylia Carmack was reported missing by the very person who had taken her. Amanda Carmack called it in herself, stood before police in the community, watched as volunteers fanned out across Grant County searching fields and streets and alleyways, said nothing, and went home to light candles in the shed behind the house on East South D Street. The reason for the candles would only make sense later, and by then, Skylia was already gone. Gas City is the kind of place where people know each other, where a missing child becomes the whole community's emergency within hours.
When the silver alert for Skylia went out, neighbors posted flyers, strangers drove unfamiliar roads calling her name, and Indiana State Police set up around-the-clock surveillance on the family's home. It had the shape of a community holding its breath for good news. It was, instead, a community standing 50 feet from the truth and not yet knowing it. Skylia Rain Carmack was 10 years old, a fourth grader with a bright, open face and the kind of energy that fills a room. She lived in a household with her father, her stepmother Amanda, and 6 other children. By outward appearances, the home was full, busy, and ordinary, but children who grow up in a home where something is wrong develop a particular literacy for danger, and investigators who later spoke to the other children in that house noted something that stopped them cold. When the name Amanda Carmack was spoken aloud during interviews, the children became visibly distressed. Not one of them, several of them. That detail, quiet and devastating, told its own story about what daily life in that home had felt like. For 4 days, the community searched. For 4 days, Amanda Carmack gave interviews, cooperated with police, and maintained the posture of a distraught parent. Then, on September 4, 2019, investigators executed a search of the property and found what they were looking for. Not far away, not hidden with any particular sophistication, but right there, in the shed behind the family home. Skylia's body had been placed in plastic trash bags. A pillow, a blanket, and a backpack had been placed with her. A pair of multicolored trousers had been knotted around her neck. She had been dead for 4 days. The Grant County coroner determined the cause of death to be asphyxia by strangulation. Amanda Carmack was arrested the same day. When detectives initially asked whether she had done anything to Skylia, her response was chilling in its detachment. "I don't remember," she said, and then, "It doesn't matter." But she eventually did speak, and what she admitted to, in a recorded statement to investigators, was that she had used her hands to choke the child and then tied something around her neck. When pressed on why, she offered one word: anger. She had been very angry. That was all. The legal road that followed was long and at points procedurally complicated. At her first trial in October of 2020, the proceedings collapsed into a mistrial, not because of any issue with the evidence, but because of complications arising from the COVID-19 pandemic that made continuing impossible. The case was rescheduled.
Her defense team filed a motion for a change of venue, arguing that the level of public outrage in Grant County, including a social media petition demanding the death penalty, made a fair local trial impossible. The motion was denied. Prosecutors moved forward in Marion, Indiana. At the second trial, held in August of 2021, Carmack's defense attorney, David Payne, argued that this was not a case of murder at all. His position was that his client had been suffering from depression and debilitating migraines in the weeks leading up to Skylia's death, that she had simply snapped under the pressure of raising 7 children, and that what had occurred was manslaughter, a spontaneous act of a fractured mind, not a deliberate decision. He pointed out that Skylia's body had not been carefully concealed, arguing this showed no attempt at a genuine cover-up. The prosecution's response was simple and direct. The house was under 24-hour police surveillance from the moment Skylia was reported missing. Amanda Carmack had no opportunity to move the body. The candles she had been lighting in the shed were not a grief ritual. They were an attempt to mask what investigators would eventually find. The jury heard from the Gas City Chief of Police, from state troopers, from a Department of Child Services supervisor, and from witnesses who painted a picture of what life inside that home had been like for Skylia. Deliberations lasted less than 3 hours. The verdict was guilty, on every count: murder, neglect of a dependent resulting in death, domestic battery resulting in death to a person under 14, strangulation. When the jury reconvened to consider sentencing, they recommended life without the possibility of parole. On September 15, 2021, Grant Circuit Court Judge Mark Spitzer formally imposed that sentence. The moment that became permanently attached to Amanda Carmack's name came during cross-examination after the verdict was read. A prosecutor asked her directly why she had killed her stepdaughter.
Amanda Carmack looked back across that courtroom and said 3 words: "Things happen." Things happen. Not remorse, not explanation, not grief. 3 words that told the jury, the courtroom, the community of Gas City, and Skylia's father everything they needed to know about the woman who had been trusted with that little girl's life. Carmack appealed her murder conviction to the Indiana Supreme Court, arguing that her actions constituted voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, that there had been sufficient provocation to reduce the charge. In January of 2023, the court rejected that argument in full, affirmed the murder conviction, and upheld the sentence of life without parole. Judith Carmack remains incarcerated in Indiana today. Skylia Carmack was 10 years old. She had 6 brothers and sisters who watched police cars pull up to their home. She had a community that spent 4 days hoping. She had a father who trusted the wrong person with the most important thing in his life. What she did not have, what she deserved more than anything, was someone in that house who chose her, just once. Someone who looked at a 10-year-old child and decided that she was worth protecting. That person never came, and for Skylia, it was already too late by the time the rest of the world started looking.
Case number 8, Nicole Lee Scott. Children learn early that hunger passes if you ignore it long enough. The stomach stops growling. The dizziness becomes familiar. Eventually, the body turns on itself, consuming muscle tissue, shutting down non-essential functions, prioritizing survival over growth. 12-year-old Gavin Peterson experienced this slow deterioration not in some war-torn nation or famine-stricken region, but inside a comfortable house in West Haven, Utah, where his father and stepmother controlled every morsel of food that entered his mouth. By the time emergency responders arrived on July 9, 2024, Gavin's organs had already begun failing. His body, emaciated beyond recognition, had nothing left to give. What turns a home into a place of systematic deprivation? Nicole Lee Scott, 51 years old at the time of her arrest, would later claim in court that Gavin was a difficult child, one who overwhelmed her, one whose behavior demanded extraordinary measures. Her defense attorney echoed this narrative during sentencing hearings, painting a picture of a woman struggling to manage a challenging stepson. But the evidence told a different story, one of deliberate cruelty, careful planning, and a household where a child became the target of sustained hatred. The Peterson family appeared ordinary from the outside. Shane Peterson, Gavin's biological father, worked to support the household. Nicole managed the home. Tyler Peterson, Gavin's older brother, lived there as well. But within those walls, a different reality existed. Gavin had been pulled from public school in May of 2023, effectively cutting him off from the teachers, counselors, and staff members who had noticed concerning signs. A school nurse had reported infected fingers. Personnel observed clear signs of malnourishment. Each report to the Division of Child and Family Services prompted the same response from Nicole and Shane: remove Gavin from view. If no one could see him, no one could intervene. The isolation allowed the abuse to escalate without external scrutiny. Surveillance cameras monitored Gavin's room constantly, but not for his protection. The family used the cameras to track his every movement, to ensure he remained confined, to document compliance with their restrictions. Footage recovered by investigators showed a child wearing only a heavily saturated diaper, confined to a room without carpet, bedding, or blankets. Sores covered his back from lying on bare floors. The recordings captured a boy reduced to less than human in the eyes of the adults responsible for his care. Text messages between Nicole, Shane, and Tyler revealed the systematic nature of Gavin's deprivation. They discussed whether to allow him 1/3 of a cup of water. They debated giving him a piece of bread with mustard versus withholding food entirely. In May of 2023, Nicole sent messages to Shane expressing her feelings about a school report regarding Gavin's infected fingers. She wrote that he did these things for attention, that she hated it, that it made her hate him more and more. Gavin was 11 years old when she typed those words. Within a month, they had removed him from school permanently, eliminating the last witnesses to his deterioration.
The language Nicole used when referring to Gavin in private communications revealed how completely she had dehumanized him. Prosecutors noted that she frequently used slurs and degrading terms. She spoke of him as a problem to be managed, an obstacle to be controlled, rather than a child who needed care. This linguistic distancing allowed her to justify actions that would otherwise be incomprehensible. If you convince yourself someone isn't fully human, it becomes easier to withhold the basic necessities of life.
Gavin's biological mother, Melanie Peterson, had been trying desperately to regain custody. She had not seen her son since 2019, blocked from access by Shane, who refused her visitation. She filed reports, she made efforts through proper channels, but the system failed to act quickly enough, and Gavin remained trapped in a household where his stepmother orchestrated his slow destruction. Prosecutors would later describe the environment as nothing short of a prolonged death camp for the boy. On the afternoon of July 9, 2024, someone from the Peterson residence called emergency services to report an unresponsive child who had been ill for several days and was no longer breathing. First responders arrived to find family members attempting CPR on the bathroom floor. Gavin was transported to a nearby hospital where medical staff pronounced him deceased. The subsequent examination revealed the extent of his suffering: severe malnutrition, complete organ shutdown, a body visibly emaciated. At 12 years old, Gavin had literally starved to death while living with people who had access to food, water, and resources. Search warrants executed on the cell phones of Nicole, Shane, and Tyler uncovered the deleted text conversations discussing beatings and food deprivation. Nicole had attempted to erase screenshots from the surveillance system, but investigators recovered them from the trash folder on her device. The digital trail provided incontrovertible proof of what had happened within that house. Police also discovered illegal narcotics in common areas of the home, adding substance charges to the mounting evidence against the adults. The Division of Child and Family Services had received reports about Gavin as early as 2020. Multiple notifications about potential abuse reached the agency charged with protecting vulnerable children. Yet the system's failures, high caseloads, significant staff turnover, procedural gaps allowed the abuse to continue unchecked for years. By the time law enforcement became involved, intervention came too late to save Gavin's life. Nicole Leah Scott initially faced charges of child abuse homicide. As part of a plea agreement reached in April of 2025, that charge was amended to first-degree murder, with an additional aggravated child abuse charge added. She pleaded guilty to 8 charges total: murder, 3 counts of aggravated child abuse, 2 counts of obstruction of justice, child endangerment, and possession of a controlled substance. During the plea hearing, she cried as she admitted her actions contributed to Gavin's death. Her sentencing took place on May 12, 2025, before Judge Camille Nider in Ogden's 2nd District Court. The judge imposed sentences to run consecutively: 15 years to life for murder, 2 terms of 1 to 15 years for aggravated child abuse charges, 2 terms of 1 to 15 years for obstruction of justice, up to 5 years for child endangerment, and up to 364 days for the controlled substance charge. Judge Nider characterized Nicole as the architect of abuse within the home, noting she could have stopped the cruelty at any point during at least 5 years, but instead recruited Tyler to help punish Gavin. In her remarks from the bench, Judge Nider addressed Nicole directly, stating that she should never again have contact with children, should never see the outside of a prison, and that such treatment should never happen to another 12-year-old boy who was starved to death in response to perceived behavioral issues. The judge noted she would communicate with the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole to recommend Nicole never be released. Unlike other sentencings where she might offer hope of eventual freedom, Judge Nider said she could not provide that ray of hope to Nicole Scott. Shane Peterson, Gavin's father, pleaded guilty to 5 charges, including child abuse homicide, and received the maximum sentence possible. Tyler Peterson, the older brother who participated in the abuse, was found to suffer from multiple psychological disorders. His sentencing was postponed pending further evaluation. The case against all 3 family members exposed not just individual cruelty, but a conspiracy of adults who viewed a child's suffering as appropriate punishment for behavior they found inconvenient.
Prosecutors read victim impact statements during sentencing, including one from a DCFS worker who had tried unsuccessfully to help Gavin. The worker described how surviving children in abusive households learn to scapegoat, to blame victims, and to lack empathy for suffering. School personnel who had known Gavin described him as respectful, kind, loving, and hungry. His only reported transgression was taking food because Nicole refused to feed him adequately. What everyone else saw was a good child trying to survive. Nicole Leah Scott now serves her consecutive sentences in a Utah state facility. Gavin Peterson remains permanently 12 years old, his brief life marked by isolation, deprivation, and systematic cruelty from the very people tasked with nurturing him. His biological mother carries the burden of guilt despite having no power to stop abuse she couldn't see. And in West Haven and beyond, the case stands as a stark indictment of systems that failed to protect a vulnerable child despite years of warning signs.
Case number 9. Shamdai Arjun. She had been in America for only a matter of months. She did not yet know the city, did not speak the language with any confidence, and had no friends in the neighborhood beyond the family that shared the cramped two-bedroom apartment on a quiet block in Richmond Hill, Queens. 9-year-old Ashdeep Kaur had crossed an ocean to be with her father, carrying with her the hope her mother had packed alongside everything else, that life in New York would be better, wider, full of the kind of possibility that a little girl in rural India could only imagine. It was not. The woman waiting for her on the other side of that journey was Shamdai Arjun, and within 3 months Ashdeep would be gone. Shamdai Arjun was born in Trinidad and had, by the time of these events, been married to Ashdeep's father, Sukhjinder Singh, for some years. The couple had relocated to the Richmond Hill section of Queens, a neighborhood known for its large Indo-Caribbean community, where immigrants from India and the Caribbean have built a dense, self-sustaining world of temples, restaurants, and family networks. Singh worked long shifts at a Crown Fried Chicken restaurant in Brooklyn, leaving the apartment each day before the sun was fully up and returning well into the evening. That arrangement left Shamdai as the primary adult presence in the home during working hours. It left Ashdeep, newly arrived, still adjusting to a new country, a new language, and a new family structure, entirely in her stepmother's hands. What those hands were capable of, the people who knew Ashdeep would later make clear. Relatives of the girl told investigators and media that the abuse had not started suddenly, it had accumulated. Ashdeep had been mistreated by Arjun on multiple occasions in the months after her arrival. Queens Assistant District Attorney Michael Curtis would later state publicly that Arjun had on multiple occasions threatened to take the child's life. These were not idle words spoken in anger and forgotten. They were a pattern, a forecast, and no one who heard them acted in time to change what was coming. On the morning of August 19, 2016, Ashdeep Kaur went into the bathroom of the apartment she shared with her father, her stepmother, and 2 of Arjun's young grandchildren. She was 9 years old. The bathroom door was locked behind her. Hours passed. The other family that shared the apartment, a second household crowded into the same space to divide the rent and the utility bills, noticed that the bathroom light had been on since approximately 11 in the morning. By early afternoon, it was still on. By mid-afternoon, still on. No sound from inside. No movement. The mother from that second family, noticing the strangeness of it, grew uneasy. At around 5:30 in the evening, she encountered Arjun in the hallway, leaving the apartment with her 2 grandchildren. She asked, in the broken English that was all the 2 women shared between them, where Ashdeep was. Arjun said the child was washing her hair and left quickly. Something about the answer did not sit right. The woman called Sukhjinder Singh at work. Singh told her to break through the bathroom door. When it gave way, what they found inside was not a child washing her hair. Police and emergency services arrived to find Ashdeep Kaur unresponsive in the bathtub. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner's office would later determine the cause of death to be manual strangulation. In the hours after the discovery, detectives fanned out across Queens looking for Arjun. They found her at the South Ozone Park residence of her former husband, Raymond Narayan, where she had gone with her grandchildren after leaving the apartment. When officers arrived at Narayan's door, neither Arjun nor Narayan would open it. For over an hour they refused. Narayan was eventually charged with obstruction of government administration for his role in delaying her apprehension. When the door finally opened and Arjun emerged, she was placed under arrest and charged with second-degree murder. The trial began in April of 2019, nearly 3 years after Ashdeep's death. Lead prosecutor Denise Torino stood before the jury and painted a portrait that will not have been easy to hear. She described Ashdeep as the Cinderella of the household, denied food, denied affection, singled out in a home where Arjun's own grandchildren were treated with warmth and care. The contrast was not accidental, it was the operating system of the household. One set of children loved, one child othered. The jury heard from the neighbor who had noticed the bathroom light, from witnesses who placed Arjun leaving the building while Ashdeep lay inside, and from the forensic evidence that told the story of what had happened behind that locked door. The defense, led by attorney Eric Greenberg, argued that the evidence was insufficient to support a murder conviction, noting there were no eyewitnesses to the act itself and pointing out that Arjun's departure from the building had been pre-planned rather than a panicked flight. The jury weighed those arguments. They deliberated for less than 1 hour. On May 10, 2019, Queens Supreme Court Justice Kenneth Holder received a verdict of guilty on the charge of second-degree murder. On June 3, 2019, Arjun appeared before Justice Holder for sentencing. Acting Queens District Attorney John Ryan addressed the court with a statement that cut through the procedural language of the occasion. He said that Arjun went beyond the tales of evil stepmothers, that she had wrapped her hands around her stepdaughter's little neck and squeezed the life out of her. Justice Holder sentenced Shamdai Arjun to an indeterminate term of 22 years to life in prison. Given her age at the time of sentencing, that sentence is, in practical terms, likely to mean she will never leave custody. Ashdeep Kaur's mother had sent her daughter across the world because she believed it would give her a better life. She had trusted a father to protect her and trusted the family that father had built to receive her child with at least basic human decency. Ashdeep arrived in America in the spring of 2016, wide-eyed and new, full of the particular resilience that children carry into unfamiliar places when they believe the adults around them are safe. She had 3 months. 3 months in a country she was still learning to read, in a home where one woman had already decided, long before August 19th, exactly how this was going to end.